am Quintessence. I'm with PagerDuty, and I'm here to talk to you today about unquantified serendipity or diversity in development. And before I get started, I like to be very clear that this is a very non-prescriptive talk. And what I mean by that is I'm going to be saying a bunch of things kind of back to back towards the end there. And it's about ways that you can eliminate some bias and some other things to keep in mind while you're moving through tech. Things that may be for mentorship and other things, but some of these things may apply to you, some of them may not. So I kind of call it choose your own adventure style way to proceed. So just keep that in mind. And now that I've said all of that, let's jump right in. So why do we hire people, right? When we're hiring people, we're normally doing something about the job rec where we say, oh, we want to have a JavaScript developer. Oh, we want someone who understands Perl or Python, and so on and so forth, right? Someone who can do AWS or whatever the job rec is. And this is a very straightforward thing, but what job recs don't always call out is the other things that factor into the decision. For example, you might need someone who knows AWS, but you might also need someone who needs to be in a leadership role. You might also need someone who knows certain AWS services. There are a couple more than others. And so you're trying to augment what the existing team looks like or build a new team from scratch with, a very specific intersection of skill sets. And so when we talk about, the way that these things kind of gear mesh, we're trying to figure out what these other people bring to the table. And this gets into perception. And so basically we're trying to unconsciously focus on diversity they bring and see if it matches our meeting needs. So maybe we want to bring someone with a specific background of relevance. Do they speak a language in an area or a market or whatever that's trying to be targeted, in addition to knowing, I'm just going to keep picking on AWS because they're big and I can. So in addition to knowing AWS, do they also have different spoken or signed languages? Do they specifically have signed languages when maybe there wasn't a focus for that before? Can they bring accessibility to the table and so on? But we don't always perceive these differences the same across the board, depending on how the person visually presents. And that brings me to why I kind of titled the talk the way I did. So there are a few things at play. There's what are we hiring for beyond what's in the job rec? That's a very direct academic style way of looking for humans. And there's how do we perceive what we're finding? And can we actually see what we're looking for? One of the things that I like to explain for the problem space is why diversity is important. And I do this by the story of where's the diacritic S, and I do it in Where's Waldo colors because it amuses me. And so in 2015, I came across this blog post that I reused to death because it's really great. I have it linked in my notes at the end. But basically, Marcin, who was a typographer at Medium, he wrote up this article in 2015 because they received a bug report for the blog platform. And it was simply put, I cannot type a diacritic S. And immediately people went, we don't do anything with typesetting like in the text area of the blog. So there's a lot of confusion as to why this would happen. But this particular person, per growing up Polish, was like, well, actually, I know why this is happening. And the blog post is very interesting. And that's why I linked to it, because he actually goes into like the history of keyboards in Poland as to why this came out. But the conclusion of it is basically the way you type a diacritic S on a non-native Polish keyboard. So like when you use maybe an English keyboard for Polish is the same way you hit save, which is Command S. Which means that they weren't maybe trying to interfere with the typesetting, but they were trying to keep people from saving index.html to their desktop. And the reason this is very relevant to diversity is, what do you think the odds are that they hired him to solve this particular problem, right? They didn't hire him to solve this problem. They hired him, and it increased their solution space because it increased the surface area that they could hit by the knowledge that they brought into their team. So this goes back to, what are we hiring for? There are the so-called hard skills, the so-called soft skills, but there's also, when you have a diverse environment, you get to catch in all of these other things that you're not going to be looking for. You don't know how to quantify them. You don't know that you're going to get a bug report about a very specific character in somebody's language. The current state of diversity, or at least diversifying with intention, is newish, right? So before we went through various phases in development where maybe there was a certain group that was overrepresented and that became rather self-sustaining. And then there was a period where, diversity is good. We don't really know why it seems to do things, but we weren't really trying to drive for it. It was one of those things that passively happened, like, oh, we hired someone and huzzah, and we move forward. But when you're trying to do it with intention, it's new and it's complex. So the example I like to give for it's complex is someone who might not discriminate against me because I'm white and a woman might discriminate against me for being a lesbian. Or if I were trans, they might discriminate against me for that, or so on and so forth. So you get more and more what are called intersections that are kind of vectors of how you perceive the person that you're talking to. And can you actually push that diversification effort forward? And how much can you, focus on that area? I actually covered all this, so we're just going to go to what we can do. So when we're talking about something that's fragile, so when you're trying to do something new, that's really, you're trying to chart it out and you're trying to protect groups and you're trying to know who can be protected, right, within the organization, you need to start to develop strategies around those historically underrepresented groups. And part of this is life being a series of experiences. And this I want to call out because before I mentioned about how are you perceiving. So you might have someone who doesn't talk a lot in a meeting and you really just wish they would. And to you, if you're their boss, you might see it as a problem you need to fix. And so when you approach them as a problem, you talk to them like a problem. It might not necessarily be combative or aggressive, but it's not great, right? If anyone's ever been on the receiving end of this, but if you're especially if you're from an underrepresented group, but if you're just shy as well, you might have been in a situation where you were put down for speaking up because who listens to the intersectionality here? Who listens to the woman? Who listens to the queer person? Who listens to? And so you've been socialized either assertively or passively to not do the behavior that the person who's treating you like a problem suddenly wants you to do, right? And so when we were thinking about this, mindset matters very much. And I repeat this with emphasis, right? When you approach the person who's not speaking up in the meeting as a problem to fix, or if you're frustrated, that will come out in your speech, even if you wish it wouldn't. But if you kind of approach it as a situation where it's bidirectional, and if you shift your mindset about why that's happening, or just increase your awareness that, oh, this person is a woman, oh, this person is not white, oh, this person is whatever they are, they may have had a lived experience that is blocking them from the behavior I want. So I'm going to meet them where they're at and see what I can do. And when we're talking about mindset matters, we're talking about how we can do little shifts to our mindset. And this goes back to what I said in the beginning about bias things. So the first one I want to touch on is coach, don't rescue. And the idea with this is, and this is something I encountered a lot early in my career, where you can show someone how to do something, or you can tell them, hey, can you look this up and come back to me with what you find? So if, for example, you're working on a coding problem and someone's like, oh, let me show you how to do that, they can show you, or they can say, oh, did you look up this concept or this? And can you, try it and let me, look at it after. The difference on a one-to-one scale is very small, but when you think about certain groups are almost always shown versus other groups almost always kind of given the opportunity to grow, you kind of get these reactive versus proactive mindsets of the engineers or whomever, really, but in this case, engineers that you're trying to mentor or train. The former is the rescuing. When you're just doing it for someone, it's not necessarily a rescuing that's very loud, where you're like charging in there and being obnoxious about it, but it is a very real thing that happens to people when they're trying to onboard, especially if they're doing a career switch. Hand up, not out is a shifting in the mindset of what type of help you're providing and how much help you're providing. So when you have, let's say, a mentee and you're trying to help them network and get involved, you want to think of yourself as like, I didn't get them that job. Like I may have facilitated their networking abilities. I may have helped introduce them to the right people and so forth. But I did not get them that job. They got them that job. I talked to them about what skills were relevant to talk about in various interviews. I followed up with them after it was a very collaborative experience. And the reason it's important to not view yourself as giving handouts or view others as receiving them is probably the very, straightforward thing that we see sometimes in industry, where people are just like, oh, they are handout, or the not so subtle things that people say about, oh, we don't want to lower the bar. We don't want to hire certain groups because we don't want to lower the bar. Oh, we don't want to do, these certain things because they're perceived as handouts. The people who are receiving them are being viewed as being given an unfair advantage or the easy track to compensate for something else, right? And this can come up a lot in diversification efforts, because a lot of times those so-called simplified paths are really trying to intentionally, when they appear, intentionally get around, systemic problems that are happening. So again, shifting the mindset from hand up, not out. Being able to accommodate diverse learning styles is also very important. This is both for mentorship or when onboarding new employees. So here's a rhetorical question. How many people get told to read the manual when they ask a question at any point in their career? Any point. Now, how many people have ever had to write documentation and can guarantee that that documentation has been written for various skill levels and backgrounds and target audiences and languages? So you have the advice of someone, I mean, if they've even written the documentation. So you have the advice, read the manual. The manual might not be written for you with the intended audience in mind. You might be a new programmer and it's written more for people who already know what's going on. So certain things are assumed as known when you personally, as the newbie, do not know them. So that doesn't help you. But also when you kind of pass it off like this, you kind of give the newbie the impression like they asked you a question. You haven't actually looked at the resource you're giving them to know if it actually suits their learning style or their learning level, so that they can actually make good use of it. And when we get into like learning styles too, there are different people with different needs. If they're using a screen reader, is the formatting of the manual, good for that? Can it even read it? Or are there lots of emoji where you get to have the screen reader read smiley face, smiley face, smiley face, smiley face, because someone thought it was funny to write it 5 times, and visually maybe it is, but if someone can't see that and they're using a screen reader, it suddenly becomes a bit much, right? You have other things that go into diverse learning styles. And, there's also, I just want to call this out before I get into my next slide. We as an industry kind of carry the perception that everyone's an autodidact. Everyone is self-taught, aren't we? That's not really a healthy mindset to have, because yes, we maybe are doing a lot of research on our own, but we're also making use of a very broad body of knowledge, right? And so giving, the newbies this impression that you're just kind of the 10x engineer, so to speak, really not healthy for them, because then they're always anxious about their development and feeling behind and so on and so forth. Speaking of, how to mentor. So we have something called reciprocal mentorship. And when I used to run a group here local to me in Buffalo, New York, one of the things that was important to remember was that your mentee may not know the thing you're trying to teach them, be it job hunting, be it Python, be it AWS, but they don't know nothing, right? They come to you with a skill set. So one of the ways that you can kind of train and teach them to maybe not develop imposter syndrome later, or at least help defer that a little bit, is to take advantage of anything they do bring to the table. So like if you're working on an iOS app and they don't know how to write code for that yet, but that's what they're here to learn, but they are really good at image manipulation, cool. Apps have images, right? They can make use, they can still contribute to the project without feeling like they're just here to soak everything up as a sponge, but they didn't contribute to it. And you can see that come out in their language later, because when you listen to how newbies talk about the projects they've been assigned, if they've been assigned a very passive, like fire hose learning model, they say, oh, I learned this, I saw that, I encountered, right? Very passive receiving knowledge. But if they're given the opportunity to actually touch and build whatever they're pairing with, or however it's being structured, it's, I worked on this, I showed that, I figured out this. And it's a more active language. And that will help them more going forward too, because realistically, even if they're in the intern stage and there's a certain amount of fire hosing going on, as they go from junior to mid, and then the big gap from mid to senior, right, you're going to have a very major shift in what they're expected to do in terms of learning in parallel with doing. Something that really falls on the mentors or the more senior people on the team, depending on the context of, is this an external mentoring environment, or is this, a program that you're trying to build internal to an organization, is who's providing the challenge. And this is something that also happened to me early in my career, where a lot of the advice that I got until I landed on a mentor that I was really good working with was, oh, well, just think of a problem that you want to solve and solve it programmatically is the point. But when you're thinking of the types of problems you want to solve, the types of problems you might want to solve may not have the implementation that would benefit you to learn in the industry you're trying to target. So example for me specifically, I went to college for physics and mathematics. I wanted to be an astrophysicist. It was a whole thing. I switched in computer science. The types of problems I wanted to solve were math. The types of jobs that get you hired are being able to develop things like blogging platforms. They're not the same type of problems. They're not the same types of skill sets, right? So asking someone to kind of develop the problem, you're going to get hit twice. You're going to get hit by the types of problems that they think to solve, but also the way they think to solve them. So if they're just learning about different types of models of learning or implementation, they might not know what to look for. Like, you need to guide them. You need to have a body of at least a couple, 2 to 3, if you're starting small, projects that you're like, this is representative of either this organization or this industry for them to learn from. And this is all about building resilience. But another thing that goes into building resilience, this is about handling this, what I was calling the fragility of diversity. And so when we have a resilient organization, you have someone or a group of someones who are able to speak up when things are happening. If you are, for example, in a privileged knowledge in the company, and you know that pay is not equalized, you know who to talk to for that, and you do in a resilient org. Or you tell your mentees how to navigate it. One or the other. You do something, right? You figure out what to do. That is a good mixture of what can actually be accomplished and what you have a political sway to do. But in a kind of passive acceptance thing, you realize the pay is unequal, and then you're just like, yeah, that happens, and nothing else happens after that. And in picking on pay is relatively low-hanging fruit, but it can mean anything. It can mean, the meetings, if someone is repeatedly getting talked over, and you as the person with more power in the room say to the person who's doing the interrupting, hey, they're trying to finish their thought. It doesn't have to be, what I mentioned before about rescuing. It doesn't have to be a big show. It can just be a very simple statement, and then we all move on. And that can push you more towards resilience. The more resilient your organization is, the more like you are to attract people who don't look like you. This is what all of this is about, is making space for people who are different from us so that they can succeed with us. And that goes into helping them with that success. Something else that I also like to explicitly call out is confidence is built on knowledge and experience, which is a thing that feels obvious to say. But then I also remind people that we like to give the advice, fake it till you make it. You can fake it a little. Let's be real. If you don't have the knowledge or experience, if you're faking it in order to learn what the mechanism of confidence feels like, sure. But if you're not supplementing that with studying or mentoring or networking or whatever you've identified your gap as, the faking it will become a very visible, palpable thing, both to you and increasingly to people outside of you. And this is something that we give, a lot in terms of advice. This is something at least I heard a lot when they're just like, oh, women just aren't confident, passive bias assumption. Therefore, I will give the advice for you to just act confident without, fact checking that there might be something pushing you to believe that you shouldn't be confident for some reason. And this is something, again, to especially keep an eye out for people who are newer to industry, mentees, et cetera. Explicit onboarding also helps with diversity efforts, because if you think about it, when you don't have explicit onboarding, any sort of materials, videos, it doesn't have to be obviously the more explicit, the better, but it doesn't have to be fully rolled out from day 0. But if you don't have explicit onboarding, you have social onboarding. And so when you have social onboarding, the existing social groups will perpetuate themselves. So that might not be great if you're looking to diversify, right? So if you have a bunch of people who are in their 20s and not married and don't have children, and they're looking to hire parents who do, and they don't have explicit onboarding, but hey, it's okay. They meet after work and do stuff for that. You have to pick up your kids. So you know what I mean? If you rely on this social onboarding, there are all sorts of ways that this can come up where it will actually not help you. Whereas if you have explicit, you have the person, we'll say the newbie is assigned to me. I am the explicit person that's helping them. They have materials that they're reading. They have me, so they know if they're afraid to ask anybody else questions, they're told to ask me questions. So like, that's my job. And that, you know, sometimes people are still afraid to ask questions, but at least they know that they don't have to like ask anybody. There's a designated person to ask. And if I don't know, I then take care of figuring out who to ping it to, right? And that's my job. And all these things can help newbies, especially if they're maybe the first or the second or very early on in terms of people who are newer to the org, right? It's also important for people to know their worth. And I start thinking about this mainly in response to, is DevOps a title? People like to argue about this. I mean, DevOps very realistically is a title you can Google for. People have it, they possess it, therefore it's a title. Whether or not it should be is the argument that people like to have. But when you look at some of, at least in the States, we get what I like to nickname the DevOps task. If you have a role where it could be described as infrastructure engineer, or it could be described as DevOps engineer, one of these roles pays higher than the other. So if you're advocating for yourself, if you're advocating for someone else, or teaching them how to advocate for themselves, or all of the above, it's important to know if there are various titles in your industry and some of them pay higher than others, it doesn't matter if the job title should exist or not. It matters that you should advocate to have it so that you can maximize the benefit for your skill set. When you're getting started, you usually build out a professional network. I nickname it the hiring nucleus. These are the who's who, either local to your city or local to your country or local to whatever, you know, your sphere of your impact, your blast is. If you know it and you have a mentee, you should make sure they know it too, because realistically, even though maybe quote unquote everybody's hiring, there's usually a who's who of, if I ask so-and-so, they'll know if someone's looking for a job, and now they know I'm looking to hire someone, and they'll connect us, hopefully. Right. And so once you start to get that who's who network going, both it benefits you, but then you pass it on to any mentees you have. And second to last thing, open coffee, lean coffee. This is something I know that we're doing a lot in the States. I don't know if this is something that's going over there as well. It's a good idea, I think. And the idea is to have anyone like in the IT industry meet and just do breakfast, do coffee, do tea, do whatever makes sense, so that you have an intersection of skill sets and you have an intersection of seniorities that would not organically meet otherwise. How often would a front-end developer have reason to speak to an SRE in a non-ticket context, right? If you do something like this gives people an idea to know more about what each other does and how to interact with each other more favorably. And just as a last note, I mentioned having slides. They'll go up after I finish this presentation, but that's the link they'll go up at. So if you want to look at these slides for any reason, this is where they are. And I'll thank you for your time.